Rise of the European Emperor by Taishang Laoniao.
Chapter 571 Appeal. Marin actually had a plan for the use of zinc metal produced by the Bakken's lead zinc mine in Newfoundland. The first use, of course, is to use it for hot dip galvanizing to make tinplate. For example, in order to prevent bombardment, the city gate can be covered with a thicker tinplate, or tinplate. In this way, the city gate's ability to resist bombardment is greatly enhanced. And the tinplate is very resistant to corrosion and is not afraid of wind and sun. Of course, the silver tinplate covering the city gate looks quite luxurious. If you don't know, you might think it's made of silver. But to the outside world, Marin will definitely say it's tinplated tinplate. Of course, tinplate can also be used to wrap the lower part of the waterline of the wooden boat. Although the galvanized tinplate is not very resistant to seawater corrosion, it is definitely much better than ordinary iron plate. Although it can't catch up with the good corrosion resistance of copper sheet, it's cheaper. How expensive is copper now? If it's wrapped in copper sheet, the cost of this ship will be terrifying. If you use galvanized tinplate, you can just change it every year, anyway, it's cheap. The second use is to mix zinc and copper to make white copper. The function, it is used to make fake silver coins. The inferior silver coins mixed with silver and copper that are popular in Europe now look no different from white copper. The inferior silver coins are forged with white copper, and ordinary people can't tell the real from the fake. Marin plans to use white copper to counterfeit French silver coins in large quantities, and then use the fake silver coins to buy things from the French to cheat the French. As for the third use, it is also very important. Marin plans to use zinc to make zinc sulfate as a simple pesticide. The characteristics of zinc sulfate are similar to those of copper sulfate, and it can replace the Bordeaux mixture of copper sulfate and become a pesticide for preventing and controlling pests and diseases. Although the effect is not as good as those pesticides in later generations. However, it is still no problem to deal with general pests and diseases. At least, it is much better than not using pesticides. Moreover, the production cost of zinc is lower than that of copper, mainly because the copper content of copper mines is very low, mostly around 1%, while the zinc content is much higher. Using zinc to produce copper sulfate as a pesticide has a lower cost than copper sulfate. On the Great Inagua Island east of Cuba, when processing laterite nickel ore, nickel sulfide, a large amount of sulfuric acid and sulfurous acid byproducts are produced. It just so happens that the excess zinc produced on Newfoundland Island can be used to react with sulfuric acid, a byproduct of the processing of Moa laterite nickel ore, to produce a large amount of zinc sulfate as the most basic pesticide. The effect of this pesticide may be ordinary, but it also has the advantage of low toxicity. Moreover, zinc sulfate can also add some nutrients to fruit trees or crops, which can be regarded as a kind of auxiliary fertilizer. The most important thing is that because Marin also has a large amount of cheap sulfuric acid byproducts, the cost of producing zinc sulfate is very low and can be mass-produced. Moreover, there is no need to worry about others imitating it. Because other countries don't know what zinc is. Thinking that with zinc, Marin can use zinc to make a large amount of corrosion-resistant tinplate, and the cool scene of his cavalry after the plate armor is plated with silver, Marin laughed. This reminded Marin of a very cool organization when he played Warcraft in his previous life, the Knights of the Silver Hand. When the members of this knight group go out, they are all very cool. Why? Because the armor they wear is either gold or silver, which makes them look very rich. The plate armor coated with zinc liquid must also be shining white, just like silver. When such a group of knights come out, let alone their combat effectiveness, the sunlight reflected by the zinc layer alone can blind the opponent's eyes. Moreover, with the zinc coating, the plate armor is not easy to rust. Which is both pretentious and practical. Besides, the zinc sulfate pesticide is not only easy to make, but also has the characteristics of strong confidentiality. If the original Bordeaux mixture is used, the blue characteristics of the copper sulfate solution can easily be copied by chemists from other countries. I use zinc sulfate, a white powder, like salt. Before there is a modern method of detection, you can copy it if you have the guts. As for using white copper to make fake silver coins, that's needless to say. France is very rich, right? Well, I will use white copper to make a large number of fake silver coins that do not contain silver, rob France's wealth, and buy French goods. Oak for shipbuilding, the French seem to like to use oak to make barrels and brew high-end wines, while the British prefer oak to build ships. Therefore, France has always been a landlubber, while Britain has become the overlord of the sea, cattle and horses, as well as iron and copper materials. Anyway, using fake silver coins to purchase a large number of important strategic materials has caused the French to suffer losses. Although the cost of white copper is not low, because the production cost of zinc is much lower than that of copper, the cost of white copper is lower than that of pure copper coins, and naturally much lower than the cost of inferior copper-silver alloy coins made in France. At least, the inferior silver coins of France still contain silver, and the fake silver coins made by Marin do not contain silver at all, and the cost is still low. In addition, the use of a spiral coin-making machine can produce fake silver coins faster and more efficiently, and the manufacturing cost is naturally lower. The only worry is that the fake white copper-silver coins produced by the spiral coin-making machine may be too exquisite, more beautiful than the genuine French inferior silver coins, and more like real silver coins. If this arouses suspicion from others, it would be ridiculous. Of course, with the current level of the French, even if they suspect, it is difficult to find out the problem. At that time, a large number of fake silver coins that do not contain silver will flood the French market, which will surely make a lot of money from the French and hit the French economy. Just as Marin was calculating the French with a sinister look on his face, Edward of the York family was busy appealing to the Holy See on the island of Ireland. After receiving Marin's letter, he was surprised to see that Marin generously admitted in the letter that he was the behind-the-scenes figure of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. Such a powerful person stood on this side from the beginning. Although this person likes land and minerals, it is not unacceptable. The most important thing is that without strong foreign aid, Edward has no confidence in defeating Henry VII, not at all. He was not a fool. He knew that the reason why France and Scotland supported him was to make England chaotic, not to be really friendly with him. But Marin was different. This powerful German military noble had no conflicts with England and would not be hostile to England's strength. Moreover, this guy was not a monarch, but just a vassal noble. 4. Such a person, even if he was given 1 or 2 counties, it would be nothing. Because he would get more. Moreover, Edward thought that his sister Margaret's suggestion was very wonderful. Arranging Marin's fiefdom on the northern border would allow Marin to help guard the northern border, and at the same time, he could use the Scottish troops to contain Marin's army in the fiefdom. And the advice Marin gave to Edward in the letter also made Edward very interested. Why? If he could get the support of the Holy See, he would be the legitimate king of England, and at that time there would be a large number of supporters who would choose to support him. Unlike now, there are basically no people supporting him, making it difficult for him to compete with Henry VII. So Edward of the York family took action immediately. Of course, he did not immediately send someone to Rome to appeal, but first sent envoys to France and Scotland to ask them to help confirm that he was indeed Edward of the House of York and prove his legal identity. Then, he sent people to the Roman Catholic Church to appeal, accusing Henry VII of sending troops to kill the king, and asking the Church to declare Henry VII a regicide, and that he was the legitimate heir to the throne of England. France and Scotland seemed very interested in Edward's idea of appealing. Knowing that Edward's envoys would go to Rome to appeal, France and Scotland not only sent people to accompany Edward to Rome to help prove his identity, but also strongly supported Edward's appeal. As long as the appeal is successful, then King Henry VII of England will become a villain regicide. Then, Edward's identity can instantly become the legitimate heir to the throne, and he will have more and more supporters. Then, there will be a better chance to defeat Henry VII. Chapter 572 The Pope's Judgment. In fact, if Edward had sent someone to appeal to the Vatican under normal circumstances, there might not have been a good result. Why? Because the Vatican was not willing to easily offend a big country like the Kingdom of England. In any case, Britain has a population of about 3 million, that is, 3 million believers. If the Vatican easily offended King Henry VII of England, Henry VII might have turned against the Vatican and done something that was detrimental to the Church. Originally, in history, the Vatican and Britain had a falling out during the reign of Henry VIII because Henry VIII wanted to divorce Princess Catherine of Spain. Henry VIII insisted on divorcing Catherine of Aragon, but the Pope, under the influence of Spain, firmly disagreed. So, this angered Henry VIII. Originally, the Reformation did not affect England. However, because Henry VIII was hostile to the Pope who did not allow him to divorce, he simply announced that Britain would also carry out religious reforms. Moreover, the strange thing is that Henry VIII's religious reform declared that the King of England was also the head of the Church of England. Moreover, the Protestant Church in England, the Anglican Church, does not admit that it is a Protestant church, but considers itself a Catholic church. The only difference is that it no longer recognizes the Pope of Rome as the leader of the European religion, but calls the Pope of Rome the Bishop of Rome, which is equal to the status of the Archbishop of England. This new sect, Anglicanism, created because of the king's willfulness, made Henry VIII successfully divorced. Why? He himself has become the head of the Church of England, and it is not a word to approve his divorce. Moreover, after making himself the Pope of England, Henry VIII's benefits are huge. Where are the benefits? He is the Pope of England. Isn't it up to him to decide the huge property of the British Catholic Church? How to decide? Naturally, most of it belongs to the royal family. Then, the British royal family became rich and began to have money to build big ships and make artillery. The British galleons and red cannons in the UK basically appeared in the era of Henry VIII. Otherwise, how could Britain have the money to organize pirates and challenge the Spanish Empire? 2. Be honest, Marin has to give a thumbs up to the religious reform of King Henry VIII of England. This kind of religious reform, which is in their own hands and has gained a lot of benefits, is the model of religious reform for the nobles. If it were not for the hope of annexing northern Germany under the name of Catholicism, Marin would have wanted to learn from Henry VIII's wretched religious reform. Now, Henry VII's rule looks very stable. Under normal circumstances, the Holy See would definitely favor Henry VII and would not help Edward. Unless Edward seized the British throne. Otherwise, the Holy See would certainly not be willing to declare the current British king a regicide and illegal. Because this is not in the interests of the Holy See. However, now that Marin has intervened, it is another matter. Why? Because Pope Julius II is Marin's father-in-law. Julius II knew Marin's general plan, and this time Marin also wrote a letter specifically hoping that the Pope's father-in-law would help Edward speak. As long as the Holy See recognizes Edward's legal status, Marin sending troops to help Edward is fair and just, and it is reasonable and legal. Otherwise, it is assisting in rebellion, which is an act of hostility by all European nobles. Britain is isolated overseas, so it is naturally not afraid of the landlubbers on the European continent interfering in Britain's internal affairs, so it can do whatever it wants. But Marin can't do that. His territory is in the German region where group fights are most likely to occur in Europe. If he behaves in an unruly manner, he will easily be beaten up. Therefore, although Marin wants to send troops, he must find a legal excuse. If the Vatican determines that Henry VII is a regicide, then Edward will become a legitimate and just monarch. Marin sent troops to help him, which is to uphold justice. Then, no one can blame him, and it is impossible to use this as an excuse to beat him up. If Henry VII is defeated, not to mention the beautiful prospect that Marin's son Caesar can become the King of England through joint rule through marriage, even now, Marin can also obtain Newcastle's coal mines and Northumberland's land of up to thousands of square kilometers. You must know that the current Northumberland is not the Northumberland of later generations. In addition to the Northumberland of later generations, it also includes Tyne and Ware, where Newcastle is located in later generations. Of course, Tyne and Ware has an area of only 540 square kilometers. Including the 5,000 square kilometers of Northumberland in later generations, the total area is more than 5,500 square kilometers. But no matter what, an area of more than 5,500 square kilometers is indeed very large. Although the current development is not high and the population is not large, it is a place with great development potential because of its rich coal resources. As for the border with Scotland near Hadrian's Wall in the north, is it easy for war to break out? Marin doesn't care. If the Scots don't come, it's okay. If they come, they can just send troops to march straight in and destroy Scotland. In Rome, after receiving Marin's letter, Julius II naturally agreed to Marin's plan for his engaged grandson. Of course, he couldn't directly declare that King Henry VII of England was a regicide. If he really did that, Britain would immediately move the Catholic Church in the country. Maybe, by looting the Catholic Church in the country, Henry VII could also gain a lot of wealth. With this wealth, he might have enough money to recruit tens of thousands more soldiers and horses. So, after Edward's envoys and the envoys from France and Scotland arrived in Rome, Julius II pretended to shirk responsibility several times and made the following instructions. Although King Henry VII of England claimed that the previous King Richard III had killed Edward V, Henry VII has not been able to find the bodies of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Therefore, Richard III's killing of the king is only a theoretical situation. In the absence of evidence, Henry VII is also suspected of killing the king. This passage seems to be said in a tactful way, and it does not openly say that Henry VII killed the king. However, this passage put a big hat of suspect of regicide on Henry VII, which is very fatal. With the big hat of suspect of regicide, Edward has room to play. Although Pope Julius II only said that Henry VII was a suspect of regicide, as a mortal enemy, Edward could completely publicize Henry VII as a regicide. Anyway, the common people are not so smart and uneducated, how can they know the difference between regicide and suspected regicide? As long as the propaganda is good, Henry VII will be a regicide. What, you deny it? Okay, you find the body of Edward V and show it to me. Henry VII naturally can't produce the body of Edward V, so Edward can take the opportunity to determine that Henry VII committed regicide. Of course, Julius II did not say it to the end, but just planned to send someone to urge Henry VII to find the body of Edward V as soon as possible to clear his suspicion of suspected regicide. But Julius II had heard Marin say that Edward V and his brother were built into the wall, and with Henry VII's ability, he was afraid that he could not find them. So, this is also a disguised favoritism to Edward. However, the envoys of France and Scotland raised objections. They expressed their concern that Henry VII would find a boy's body to fool the Vatican. Therefore, the envoys of the two countries proposed that the Holy See should send a group of priests and autopsy experts to supervise Henry VII's search for Edward V's body. At the same time, France and Scotland would also send a group of priests and autopsy experts to London to identify the authenticity of the body that England might find, to prevent Henry VII from making false statements. Pope Julius II agreed to the requests of the two countries. However, in order to show that he was not biased towards France and Scotland, Julius II also allowed England to find friendly countries to send priests and autopsy experts to judge the authenticity, to prevent the French and Scottish autopsy experts from denying the real body of Edward V. This behavior seems very fair. But Julius II knew that Henry VII would not be able to find the body of Edward V. Because the burial location of Edward V's body was too hidden. If Marin hadn't told him, Julius II himself would not have figured it out. Unless Henry VII had the courage to demolish the Tower of London, it would be possible to find the body of Edward V. But that possibility is very low. So, this seemingly fair ruling is actually protecting Edward. More strictly speaking, it is protecting the father of the future daughter-in-law of his grandson, Little Caesar. Zinc is definitely cheaper than copper. The production of zinc is very simple. As long as you put a condenser on the top of the furnace while smelting lead, you can cool the zinc vapor. The condensed zinc vapor is crude zinc, which becomes zinc ingots after scraping it off and smelting it twice. Moreover, the zinc content in general lead zinc ore is much higher than that of copper. Half of the copper ore contains only 1 or 2% in the ore, or even less than 1%. Zinc generally has a few percent, or even more than 10%. Therefore, the cost of obtaining zinc is much lower than that of copper. In the current international market, the price of zinc is more than 20,000 yuan per ton, while the price of copper is as high as 50,000 or 60,000 yuan per ton. Therefore, zinc is several times cheaper than copper. Chapter 573, Louis XII's Decision. While a group of people were discussing how to deal with Henry VII in Rome, Henry VII was still unaware of it. In fact, Henry VII's support rate in England is still very high. In particular, the great nobles basically support Henry VII. Of course, those who do not support Henry VII have also been eliminated by Henry VII. Henry VII is not a good person, otherwise he would not have killed Edward. Those who oppose him are basically either imprisoned in the Tower of London or killed. Therefore, the existing great nobles basically support Henry VII one-sidedly. The reason for this is also related to the unpopularity of Richard III at the beginning. Of course, this does not mean that Richard III is not a good king. In fact, Richard III is still a very capable king and a good politician. However, because of the immoral behavior of killing Edward V and his brother Richard, the Duke of York, Richard III was hated by the aristocracy. In addition, Richard III was a monarch who advocated the rule of law and promulgated some laws to protect the human rights of ordinary people, which caused displeasure among the aristocracy. After all, the nobility was originally a privileged class, and Richard III's actions were tantamount to opposing the nobility. Therefore, Richard III was hated by the nobles. When Henry VII came, the noble members of the London Parliament even thought that Henry VII was their Joshua, who saved them from the rule of the tyrant. In fact, the nobles were just dissatisfied with Richard III's restriction of the privileges of the nobility through laws. Of course, the death of Edward V was also one of the reasons. In addition, Shakespeare, the great British playwright, portrayed Richard III as a lame, hunchbacked, obscene and evil image in the play, Richard III. But the actual situation is that the information Shakespeare knew about Richard III was obtained from the chronicles written by Thomas More, the Chief Justice of Henry VIII. But the problem is that when Thomas More wrote it, Richard III had been dead for decades. And Henry VIII, in order to show his orthodoxy, blackened Richard III without negotiation. Moreover, Marin has read news reports from later generations, saying that British archaeologists dug up the remains of Richard III and found that Richard III did not have the limb atrophy described by Thomas More. There was no hunchback, only a slight curvature of the spine. But in fact, this slight curvature of the spine is a common phenomenon among English longbowmen, and is the result of long-term bout pulling. In short, the bad rumors about Richard III were basically blacked out by Thomas More under the command of Henry VIII. Just like a shameless emperor who called himself 10 perfect old man, burned hundreds of thousands of documents left by the Ming dynasty. Then, Ji Xiaolan and others were sent to compile the so-called 24 histories. In fact, what kind of compilation is this? It is clearly a tampering of historical materials, and all the materials that do not conform to the shameless emperor have been deleted and revised. Then, the history books that everyone sees are all harmonious versions. What is the situation with the harmonious version of the 24 histories? Of course, it is a shameless emperor who fabricated a Qianlong prosperity out of thin air. In fact, during the Qianlong period, the early Qing dynasty was indeed prosperous. Because that was the foundation laid by Yongzheng, the most talented emperor of the Qing dynasty. In fact, Yongzheng was the most diligent and people-loving emperor of the Qing dynasty. Moreover, the population explosion of the Qing dynasty was also because Yongzheng abolished the poll tax, distributing the tax on the land, and officials and gentry paying taxes together. This is the most brilliant and greatest policy of the Qing dynasty, comparable to the reform and opening up of later generations. Otherwise, how could the Qing dynasty have so many taxes? In the case that the huge group of officials and scholars did not pay taxes, how much money did the Qing dynasty have? It was not much different from the Ming dynasty. At most, the Qing dynasty exploited the people more harshly, so the tax was more than that of the Ming dynasty. But Yongzheng's policy of distributing the tax on the land, and officials and gentry paying taxes together, made the fiscal revenue of the Qing dynasty explode. At the end of Kangxi, the national inventory of silver was only 8 million taels, while at the end of Yongzheng, it reached 60 million taels, an increase of more than 7 times. But so much money was spent by the shameless emperor who called himself the 10 perfect old man. When his son Zheqing ascended the throne, the country had become a mess. This kind of person has the nerve to call himself the man of 10 perfections. His reputation was entirely promoted by the literati. Why? Yongzheng affected the interests of the literati and made them pay taxes, so the literati tried their best to discredit Yongzheng and made the greatest emperor of the Qing dynasty a tyrant. Of course, they were too ashamed to say that Yongzheng was a tyrant, because Yongzheng was really capable and diligent in his work and loved the people. Qianlong, on the other hand, allowed officials to embezzle and exploit the people. Therefore, although the officials of the Qianlong dynasty began to pay taxes, they lived very well. Therefore, in return for the favor, those shameless literati fabricated a Qianlong prosperous era. Or, the more respectable literati called it the Kangxi and Qianlong prosperous era, but they missed the Yongzheng period when Emperor Yongzheng treated the people well. I'm off topic. Anyway, Henry VIII and a certain man of 10 perfections were shameless emperors who were good at falsifying history. Henry VII in London was unaware of all this, but King Louis XII of France in Paris was well aware of it. In particular, Louis XII learned a piece of information that made him very uneasy. Edward had hooked up with Marin Hoffman, a powerful warlord in the German region. Why was Louis XII uneasy? Because all France wanted was to make England civil strife, but it had no intention of fully supporting Edward. Unless Louis XII gave birth to a son and could marry Edward's daughter Margaret. Only in this way would France support Edward at all costs. If Louis XII himself could not give birth to a son, then it would not be worth it for him to fully support Edward. Even if Edward could not give birth to a son, he would not be able to obtain the Kingdom of England through marriage. Could it be that his daughter married Edward's daughter and had a girl-girl marriage? This was against the rules, and there would be no offspring. So, Louis XII was a little nervous. Because this was out of his control. Although Louis XII supported Edward's appeal to Rome, it was only to make things difficult for Henry VII. However, Edward hooked up with Marin, that was different. According to intelligence, Marin had a powerful army of 40,000. Not to mention pulling all of them to England, even if half of them were pulled over, they could defeat the unlucky Henry VII. Louis XII knew very well that the combat effectiveness of the British army was completely second-rate. The army under Marin Hoffman was a powerful existence that could compete head-on with the Swiss mercenaries. If Marin Hoffman was willing to fully support Edward, Edward might really defeat Henry VII and become the King of England. However, who would help Edward become the King of England was particular. If France helped Edward become the King of England, then the French would have a great influence on Britain. And if Edward used Marin Hoffman's army to complete the act of seizing the throne, then France would not be so important. In the future, Britain under Edward's rule would also become an independent existence. However, after thinking about it, Louis XII decided to support Edward to become the King of England. Why? Because Henry VII was a very talented king. Britain under his leadership was gradually becoming stronger and becoming a threat to France. After all, Edward had been imprisoned by Henry VII for more than 10 years, and his education was broken and his ability was still insufficient. Moreover, Henry VII was already a mortal enemy of France, but Edward married a French noblewoman, at least much friendlier to France than Henry VII. Therefore, Louis XII naturally supported Edward more. However, he still had a worry. I heard that there are very powerful Oriental doctors around Marin. The powerful Oriental doctors mentioned by Louis XII actually refer to the two Mongolian doctors Morigen and Bader. The two of them can definitely be regarded as miracle doctors in Europe at that time. What does your Majesty mean? Count Det, who was in charge of intelligence, was a little confused. I'm afraid that the powerful doctors under Marin will find out that we gave Anna the contraceptive pill. Louis XII said worriedly. If Edward found out about this, he would definitely stop his wife, Anna, the daughter of Count Duarte, from continuing to take the contraceptive pill. Perhaps, Edward would give birth to a boy. In that case, Louis XII's plan to give birth to a son and annex England through marriage would fail. Count Duarte didn't know what to do. After all, he was a favorite minister who rose to power by flattering, and he didn't have much talent. Louis XII struggled on his face for a long time, and finally made a decision. Well, my dear, I want to send assassins. Ah. Your Majesty, you want to kill Edward. Without Edward, there is only little Margaret, a little girl, who doesn't have that much appeal to confront Henry VII. Count Duarte said in surprise. No, I plan to send assassins to Edward, but I don't plan to kill him. What does your Majesty mean? Count Duarte didn't quite understand. I want the assassin to kick Edward's balls during the assassination, so that I don't have to worry about Edward having another son. Count Duarte's face twitched. After all, Edward was the husband of his daughter Anna and his son-in-law. Louis XII was planning to kick his son-in-law's balls in front of him. Wasn't it to make his daughter Anna a widow? However, the unnatural look on Duarte's face soon subsided. Because this era does not talk about women's rights. In Count Duarte's view, if he can sacrifice his daughter's sexual happiness in exchange for the credit of the Duarte family, it is very worthwhile. At most, he can arrange a few secret lovers for his daughter afterwards. In this way, Louis XII and Count Duarte completed a conspiracy against Edward's balls. The reason why Louis XII asked Count Duarte to teach him how to kick his son-in-law's balls was because Louis XII arranged for Count Duarte to control France's intelligence work. This kind of thing naturally needs to find Count Duarte. In addition, the daughter of Count Det was Edward's wife, and Count Det had planted many people in Edward's residence. If you want the killer to successfully sneak into Edward's residence and successfully kick his balls, you really have to rely on Count Det. Moreover, for safety reasons, Louis XII specially found a ball-kicking expert from the folks. Because this person likes to kick people's lower body, very sinister. But strangely, he controls his feet very well. Those who have been kicked in the balls by him will not have their balls kicked to pieces, and it seems that they can be cured afterwards, but in fact they are no longer fertile. Even some people who have been kicked in the balls by this ball-kicking expert can still use that thing, but they can't produce offspring, and the effect is comparable to the vasectomy of later generations. Of course, this only happens under ideal circumstances. Most people who have been kicked in the balls can't use that thing. In this way, under the wise decision of Louis XII, a French folk ball-kicking expert was secretly arranged by Edward's father-in-law, Count Det, to go to Ireland to kick Edward's balls. Chapter 574, All Scheming. Although he found a ball-kicking expert, Count Det did not send him to Ireland immediately. After all, even if Marin cooperated with Edward, it would take a long time to prepare for a joint military campaign. Therefore, the French had enough time to prepare and plan. According to the plan of Louis XII and Count Det would put the ball-kicking expert in through his own people placed by his daughter Anna. Then, when he met Edward, he would suddenly rush out and kick Edward's balls. After that, the people placed by Count Det around Anna would deliberately run out to prevent the ball-kicking expert from further assassinating Edward and drive him away. In fact, he let him go. However, before that, Count Det trained Emmet, the ball-kicking expert, for a long time. What training? Ball kicking. A secret base in the northern suburbs of Paris, where Count Det trained spies. On this day, there were screams from the base. Ouch! Woo woo! Woo woo! It turned out that our expert in kicking balls, Emmet, was practicing using precise kicking techniques. Emmet was a gangster near Paris, but he was thin and weak. Gangster fights were common. Paris was a metropolis with more than 100,000 people in Western Europe, and there were many gangsters in the city. But Emmet obviously couldn't beat others with his body and force. But Emmet knew that the balls were a man's weakness. Just a light kick could make a man squat in pain and lose his fighting power. So, in the fight, Emmet kicked people's balls many times to make his opponents lose their fighting power. After fighting so many times, Emmet's kicking balls became a unique skill, and he could even grasp the timing and make his opponent lose his fighting power without damaging his balls. He could even kick his opponent's balls, and although he could recover after kicking them, he would lose his fighting power. Of course, the last point was not 100% achievable. It is also possible that the other party's eggs have recovered and their fertility has also recovered. In view of this, Count Det decided to let Emmet practice the kick the eggs technique more. Of course, Count Det could not use living people for Emmet to experiment and practice. So, Count Det found hundreds of male dogs, tied them with ropes, and brought them to the secret base, so that Emmet could practice kick the eggs on these poor male dogs. Therefore, every day there would be the miserable howling of male dogs in the base, which was very scary. Moreover, afterward, Count Det would send a veterinarian to treat the kicked male dogs, and after the treatment, he would find a female dog to seduce the male dog to see if the male dog's thing could still be used, and whether it could make the female dog pregnant after using it. After all, she was his own daughter. Count Det hoped that Emmet would kick more accurately, and at the same time make Edward lose his fertility without affecting the act, so that his daughter would not be a widow. However, even Emmet, a master of kicking eggs, could not guarantee this kind of control 100%. Therefore, those hundreds of unlucky male dogs became the unlucky targets for Emmet to practice in depth. As for if the kick was too light and did not affect Edward's fertility, Earl Det was not afraid and would just arrange Emmet to kick again. Anyway, Earl Det would arrange Emmet's retreat and would not let him finish all at once. And Earl Det secretly controlled the security of Edward's backyard through the people he sent to Anna, so it was easy for him to let people in. After all, Edward did not build a heavily guarded palace in Ireland now, so it was not difficult to send people to approach it. Moreover, the assassination could be pushed to Henry VII's people afterwards. After all, Henry VII and Edward were mortal enemies. As for how to test whether Edward still had fertility afterwards, this is simple. just arrange a few more beauties to seduce Edward. If someone gets pregnant, it proves failure, and Emmet will kick again. In fact, it is said to be kicking the balls, but Emmet, the master of kicking the balls, does not make people lose their fertility by kicking the balls. According to Emmet's many years of experience in kicking the balls, he found that when kicking the balls, he did not kick the two balls, but lifted the upper roots of the two balls. Although the eggs were not injured, they were easy to make them lose their fertility. If explained scientifically, the eggs are sperm-making organs. If they are really kicked, they will definitely become eunuchs. But using the tiptoes to accurately kick the connecting part above the balls, actually the vas deferens, and kicking it can easily cause sterilization. In fact, this is the way to cause sterilization by kicking the vas deferens, and the effect is somewhat similar to the ligation in later generations. Louis XII is insidious and cruel, but Marin is not a good bird. By keeping a close eye on the mansion of Count Det, Marin spies affiliated with the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, even the hall and guest, probably learned about the other party's obscene plan to send someone to kick Edward's balls. After hearing this, Marin felt a chill in his crotch and felt very terrible. However, Marin did not intend to remind Edward. Because Edward's balls were kicked, it was also in Marin's interest. Therefore, Marin planned to watch coldly. However, after helping Edward conquer England, Marin will tell Edward the truth. In this way, Edward will be hostile to France and will not allow French forces to enter England. In addition, Marin is also secretly calculating Louis XII and his wife. Unlike Louis XII's rough arrangement of sending people to kick Edward's balls, Marin wants to prevent France from producing a prince by drugging. Because according to memory, Queen Anne of France should have given birth to a princess. Marin dare not guarantee that Queen Anne will give birth to a princess after he has entered history. Maybe it's a prince. In that case, Marin will be tragic. Therefore, Marin sent the Fat brothers to sneak into the French palace early to serve as royal chefs for Queen Anne, and to give Queen Anne contraceptives for a long time to prevent fertility. However, this is not safe. What if the Fat brothers are exposed one day? Or, what if they happen to be sick one day and can't cook and drug Queen Anne? Therefore, Marin planned to solve the problem once and for all, to give Queen Anne drugs to completely make her fertility ineffective. In fact, Marin also wanted to imitate Louis XII and send someone to kick Louis XII's balls. However, the French palace was heavily guarded, and there were many French knights with strong martial arts in the court. It seemed very difficult to kick their king's balls in front of a group of French knights with strong martial arts. Therefore, Marin could only give drugs. Marin did not find the drug in Europe that made Queen Anne permanently infertile, but Marin knew that there must be such a drug in the Ming dynasty. As long as this drug is found and given to the queen, it will be solved once and for all. Moreover, Queen Anne will no longer give birth, and will not break her body because of the last birth and die before Louis XII. And if Queen Anne did not die, Louis XII would not divorce her and marry another woman. Why? Because the Duchy of Brittany belongs to France. If you have a son with another woman, then the inheritance of the Duchy of Brittany has nothing to do with that son. Therefore, for the sake of French unification, Louis XII would definitely try to keep Queen Anne as low as possible in giving birth to a prince. After all, Queen Anne had given birth to a daughter before, and was proven to be fertile. Moreover, Queen Anne was only 28 years old, and she was not old now. As long as Marin sent someone to the east and spent a lot of money to find this sterilizing drug and gave it to Queen Anne, then it would be a one-time solution. Moreover, if it was done covertly at this time, others would not be able to see it at all, and it would not cause direct hatred of France against Marin. There is a mistake in the previous article. White copper is not made of zinc and copper, but nickel and copper. The mixture of zinc and copper is brass, which is more like gold. Chapter 575, Withdrawal from the Four-Party Alliance. Earlier, in order to unite against the then powerful Kingdom of Denmark, Marin, Lubeck, Hamburg and Sweden formed a four-party alliance aimed at jointly militarily fighting against the Danish Kalmar Union. As a result, this four-party alliance really defeated the Danish Kalmar Union, which seemed extremely powerful before. After that, the four-party alliance gained huge benefits. Marin received compensation from a duchy and also controlled the county of Oldenburg. Lubeck and Hamburg not only divided the Duchy of Holstein, but also destroyed the Danish navy and controlled the collection of tolls in the Øresund Strait. Not only that, because of the complete prosperity of Denmark, a maritime trade competitor, Lübeck and Hamburg controlled most of the Baltic trade and had great economic benefits. Strictly speaking, Lübeck and Hamburg were the biggest winners of that war. As for Sweden, the harvest was also very large. The southern part of Sweden has been under the direct control of Denmark for hundreds of years, and it is also the most essential part of Sweden. Even because of hundreds of years of rule, there are many Danes in the coastal areas of southern Sweden. According to the habit of names, there are more Danes called Xen. As for the Swedes and Norwegians, there are more people named XX Song. In fact, Song and Sen are just different in pronunciation between the names of Scandinavians and Danes, but the meanings are actually similar. For example, Larsson, a famous Swedish football player in later generations, is actually a descendant of the Danes. Larsson was born in Helsingborg, and Helsingborg is across the Øresund Strait from Zealand, Denmark. Before Guiri rose to regain the whole of Sweden, Helsingborg and other southern coastal areas of Sweden had been under the rule of Denmark, and there were many Danes. However, when Sweden took back the southern coastal areas, it was also the time when Sweden began to take off. Because with the southern coastal areas, especially the southwestern coastal areas, Sweden can break through the Danish maritime blockade and participate in the vigorous Great Voyage. In later generations, after Sweden obtained the southern coastal areas, it did engage in great voyages. For example, the famous Gothenburg sailing ship is the most powerful proof of Sweden's participation in the great maritime trade. Therefore, helping Sweden obtain the southern coastal areas and destroying the Danish navy is clearly unlocking the great navigation skills for Sweden. Therefore, Marin was very regretful afterwards. What's more, Sweden also got the island of Gotland in the center of the Baltic Sea, which can be said to have made a big profit. In other words, in the previous military operation to defeat Denmark, Marin sent the most troops and made the greatest contribution, but he was the one who gained the least. After all, the Duchy of Schleswig is only 9,200 square kilometers in area, and its business is not well developed. Lübeck and Hamburg not only divided the Duchy of Holstein with an area of tens of thousands of square kilometers, but also eliminated the maritime trade capabilities of its commercial competitor Denmark, and controlled the Øresund Strait, with the most economic benefits. Sweden, on the other hand, has obtained the largest land area. After all, the vast area in southern Sweden is tens of thousands of square kilometers, including a precious outlet to the sea. Now, seeing that the decline of Denmark has become inevitable, Marin regrets that he was too good to Sweden. Moreover, Marin foolishly helped Sweden discover the great treasure of the rise of the entire Swedish Empire in the French copper mine. Speaking of which, Marin was really depressed and wanted to die. It can be imagined that when Marin developed the French copper mine to the extreme, the Swedes might pick peaches and squeeze out their own forces. Of course, when he was there, the Swedes might not dare. After all, Marin was a powerful lord with a large army. But if the country ruled by Marin's descendants encounters difficulties in the future, the Swedes may take the opportunity to turn against him and take back their half of the French copper mine. Of course, if Marin does not develop the French copper mine, the Swedes will develop it themselves. Throughout the 17th century, when Sweden was at its most glorious, it relied on the financial resources provided by the French copper mine to supply Sweden to compete for hegemony. Unfortunately, Guiri was a military genius, but he chose the wrong direction for hegemony. If he had not plunged into the big pit of Germany and had not met Wallenstein, his old enemy, he might have lived for decades. Decades of time are enough for Guiri to clean up Poland and Russia into his grandson. As long as he obtains the Polish hinterland or Russia, which is rich in agricultural and mineral resources, Sweden will definitely fly. Moreover, Poland was beginning to decline at that time, and Peter I, the founder of the Russian Empire, had not yet been born, and the Russians were not very strong. It is still very easy to get a lot of land from these two countries. But Guiri was too ambitious and had to get involved in the huge pit of Germany, and ended up pitting his own life. However, these are all the history of the previous life, and there is nothing to say. For the current Marin, he can foresee the decline of Denmark and the rise of Sweden. Moreover, the rise of Sweden makes Marin even more worried. Therefore, when he was in Worms, Marin hinted to the Danish king Hans that he would no longer care about the conflict between Denmark and Sweden. In fact, it is equivalent to secretly encouraging Denmark to take back the southern coast of Sweden. Marin thinks that it is much better to let a declining country like Denmark control the most prosperous southern coast of Sweden than for Sweden, the hidden army, to control the southern coast. Besides, Denmark's return to the southern coastal area of Sweden will lead to endless wars between Denmark and Sweden, affecting the development of the two countries. At that time, Marin can influence the conflict between Denmark and Sweden like a referee. See who is not doing well, and help whoever. In short, it is to encourage the two countries to fight each other so that neither country can develop. In fact, Marin has long been ready to contact Sweden for the military alliance of the Quadruple Alliance. Because, if the alliance is not dissolved, once Denmark attacks Sweden in the future, Marin will be forced to stand on the side of Sweden and send troops to attack Denmark because of the alliance. But Marin obviously does not want to intervene in the military conflict between Denmark and Sweden, so taking advantage of the opportunity to be suppressed by the nobles at the Worms Imperial Conference, Marin decided to take the opportunity to dissolve the four-party military alliance. In this way, even if Sweden and Denmark fight to the death in the future, they will have no other relationship with Marin. The reason is also easy to find: those princes don't want to see Marin have any military ambitions. However, Marin had been busy fighting and negotiating before, and he encountered the autumn harvest immediately after returning, which delayed the matter. Now that the autumn harvest is over, Marin has time, and naturally thinks of dissolving the four-nation military alliance. Therefore, Marin is now free, and immediately began to write letters to Lubeck, Hamburg and Sweden, indicating that he would stop the activities of the four-nation alliance to prove his determination to peace to the outside world. In this way, the German princes can be reassured, and they can also get out of the Swedish quagmire with a legitimate reason. Of course, the problem is that Marin has withdrawn, but Lubeck and Hamburg have not withdrawn yet. Marin is very worried that these two wealthy cities will continue to ally with Sweden and fight Denmark together. In this way, how can Denmark be bigger than Sweden? Therefore, Marin not only wrote to the two great speakers of Lubeck and Hamburg, declaring his withdrawal from the four-party alliance, but also implicitly suggested that Lubeck and Hamburg also withdraw from the military alliance of the four-party alliance. Of course, Marin was reluctant to give up Lubeck and Hamburg, two powerful political allies. Therefore, Marin expressed in his heart to Lubeck and Hamburg: although the military alliance of the four-party alliance was dissolved, Marin could establish a political and economic alliance between the Grand Duchy of the North Sea and Lubeck and Hamburg. As for Sweden, it's better to go wherever it's cool. The reason is also very simple: Sweden is not a vassal of Germany. In this way, Marin can happily remain neutral in the future and watch Denmark and Sweden tear each other apart. Chapter 576, Advice to the King of Denmark. Marin's original intention of dissolving the Quadruple Alliance was to encourage Denmark and Sweden to tear each other apart. Because if he maintained a military alliance with Sweden, King Hans of Denmark, who had been completely frightened, might not dare to send troops. However, Marin was also afraid that King Hans was too stupid to understand his original intention. Therefore, after sending a letter announcing his withdrawal from the Quadruple Alliance, Marin also wrote a secret letter to the King of Denmark in private, telling him clearly that: I would not cover Sweden anymore, and you could do whatever you wanted next. But this was just the opinion of the Marin family. Whether Lubeck and Hamburg would privately reach a military alliance with Sweden was beyond Marin's control. He only had the ability to make suggestions and could not influence the final decision of Lubeck and Hamburg. The problem now is that Denmark no longer has a navy, and it is difficult to transport troops to the Swedish land. And Lubeck and Hamburg are unlikely to allow Denmark to have warships again. Therefore, if Denmark wants to tear each other apart with Sweden, it must first obtain the support of Lubeck and Hamburg, or at least keep the two neutral. Otherwise, the Danish army cannot even cross the Øresund Strait. In line with the principle of being a good person to the end and sending Buddha to the west, Marin privately gave King Hans a suggestion: sell out Sweden's interests in exchange for the support of Lubeck and Hamburg. How to sell out Sweden's interests? Marin knew that Sweden was very excited after obtaining the ports on the southern coast. It was actively preparing to build ships and planned to participate in the lucrative maritime trade. As a Baltic country, how could Sweden not know the huge profits of maritime trade in the Baltic Sea region? Especially the salt trade, which is simply a huge profit. Other trades such as timber trade and fur trade are also profitable. Moreover, Sweden is a country with a high forest coverage rate, and most of its territory is covered with forests. Although there are mostly coniferous forests, there are also many broadleaved forests in the southern region, with abundant shipbuilding wood, oak, pine wood and so on are everywhere. Therefore, the visionary old Sten Sture began the plan of shipbuilding and maritime trade after obtaining the southern coastal areas, especially the southwestern coastal areas. Although the two important cities and ports in the north and south of the Øresund Strait, Helsingborg and Malmö, had to be temporarily loaned to Hamburg and Lübeck for garrison and control, resulting in the Øresund Strait being controlled by two external forces, Lübeck and Hamburg, old Sten Sture had a vision. He built a port city called Gothenburg at the mouth of the Gotha River on the southwest coast of Sweden. In fact, Gothenburg was originally built by Gustav II in 1619. But old Sten Sture's vision was no worse than Gustav II. Therefore, more than 100 years in advance, old Sten Sture also built the port city of Gothenburg at the mouth of the Gotha River on the southwest coast. Gothenburg is located on the southwest coast of Sweden, but on the north of the narrow Øresund Strait. This allows Sweden to get rid of the blockade of the Øresund Strait by Lübeck and Hamburg and the collection of tolls, allowing Sweden to face the Atlantic Ocean and the large market in Western Europe directly. However, old Sten Sture's approach of working alone caused displeasure in Lübeck and Hamburg. You know, after defeating Denmark, Lübeck and Hamburg basically regarded the Baltic Sea as their sphere of influence and would not allow others to interfere. In addition to Marin's merchant ships from other countries are now heavily taxed by the two cities when passing through the Øresund Strait. Therefore, the self-improvement behavior of old Sten Sture made Lübeck and Hamburg feel that their cheese was moved. However, Sweden is their military ally, and the two sides have always been members of the four-party alliance. Therefore, even if they are dissatisfied with old Sten Sture's attempt to interfere in the Baltic trade, Lübeck and Hamburg can't say anything. Before, when Marin led the army through Hamburg, he was drinking and chatting with Hamburg Grand Speaker Heisenberg. Heisenberg had complained about the Swedes' attempt to grab the cake, and Marin remembered it in his heart. This time, Marin's idea for Denmark was to use Lübeck and Hamburg's dissatisfaction with Sweden's construction of the Gothenburg port to alienate Lübeck and Hamburg's relationship with Sweden first. Then, he will fight Sweden alone. The specific approach is to make King Hans completely admit defeat to Lübeck and Hamburg, and promise that all maritime transport in Denmark will be contracted to Lübeck and Hamburg in the future. In addition, Helsingborg and Malmö will be formally ceded to Hamburg and Lübeck. At the same time, they will also be given the right to collect tolls on the Øresund Strait. This approach is quite cruel, equivalent to abolishing one's own martial arts. Of course, it is martial arts at sea. But Denmark does not need to abolish itself now, as its martial arts at sea have been abolished by Lübeck and Hamburg. Therefore, this condition is actually a public recognition of the vested interests of Lübeck and Hamburg. But he has a very critical point, that is, if Denmark obtains the southern coastal areas of Sweden, then the maritime trade and transportation of these coastal areas will be contracted to Lübeck and Hamburg. But if it is in the hands of the Swedes may use the new Gothenburg port to compete with Lübeck and Hamburg in maritime trade. In comparison, Lübeck and Hamburg, as long as they are not fools, will understand that it is obviously more beneficial for them to let the Danes control the southern coastal areas of Sweden than for the Swedes to control the southern coastal areas of Sweden. Because the Danes have completely given up their maritime interests and contracted all maritime transport to Lübeck and Hamburg. The Swedes, however, have to independently compete with Lübeck and Hamburg in trade. Moreover, the Danes have ceded Malmö and Helsingborg, which control the north and south of the Øresund Strait, to Lübeck and Hamburg, which is equivalent to allowing the two Hanseatic cities to legally control the Øresund Strait. Where can such a good thing be found? You know, according to the internal agreement of the previous four-party alliance, although Sweden is willing to give up Malmö and Helsingborg to the fleets of Lübeck and Hamburg for stationing, it requires that the fleets of Lübeck and Hamburg must withdraw within 10 to 20 years. Obviously, the Swedes do not want to give up the interests of the Øresund Strait to others. As long as the Danes are willing to give up this interest, the merchants in the two Hanseatic commercial cities of Lübeck and Hamburg will most likely agree to it. At that time, maybe Lübeck and Hamburg will privately support Denmark to confront Sweden. After all, for Lübeck and Hamburg, Denmark, which has completely lost its navy, is much easier to control than Sweden. The only question now is, with King Hans's intelligence, can he figure this out? Because he was afraid that King Hans couldn't figure it out, Marin pointed out directly in the letter that the cession of Helsingborg and Malmö was temporary, and Denmark still had a chance as long as it could take back southern Sweden. Otherwise, with Denmark losing the Jutland Peninsula and its maritime rights, decline would be inevitable. After all, after losing the Jutland Peninsula, Denmark only had a few islands left, which added up to an area of more than 10,000 square kilometers, equivalent to a larger principality. And if the fertile areas in southern Sweden were taken back, not only would the territory increase several times, but it would also be able to reach out to the Baltic Sea again. Marin hinted to Hahn semi-publicly in the letter that even if the navy was lost, it would be temporary. Because no one knows what drastic changes will happen in the European landscape in the future. If the right opportunity is found, maybe Denmark will rise again. Of course, this is Marin's trick to Denmark. With so many powers around it, how can Denmark rise? At most, Denmark will bully Sweden. But if Guiri appears in the world, it's still unclear who will bully whom. In fact, Denmark is no stronger than Sweden in terms of economy or population. Economically, due to the two wars and the loss of maritime trade rights, Denmark's economy is still on the verge of collapse, which is worse than the newly born Sweden. In terms of population, Sweden now controls Finland, and the two places add up to 850,000 people. Denmark only has more than 400,000 people left, plus Norway's 240,000, which is only more than 600,000 people. If it is a one-on-one fight, Denmark may not be able to beat Sweden. However, Denmark has an advantage that Sweden does not have at present. That is, Denmark has many friends. For example, the electorate of Saxony and the electorate of Brandenburg are both Denmark's in-laws. In addition, the Grand Duchy of Moscow also has a good relationship with Denmark. If Denmark seeks external assistance, it can completely suppress Sweden and reoccupy the southern coast of Sweden. Chapter 577, The Return of Amerigo. In addition to engaging in some conspiracies and calculating other countries, Marin has been busy setting up several chambers of commerce to sell grain during this period. This time, Marin plans to sell most of the old grain from his own family and other noble families. As for those that cannot be sold, they will be left behind and used for the food of the common people, as well as for raising pigs and brewing wine. In order to hide the true source of the grain, Marin set up more than a dozen chambers of commerce. However, the places of registration are all foreign countries. For example, Marin registered a Polish chamber of commerce, hired several Poles, and announced to the outside world that the rye they sold was rye produced in Poland. In fact, Poland is indeed a major rye producer. Marin sent people to pretend to be the Polish Chamber of Commerce to sell Polish rye, which is fine and no one doubts it. In addition, Marin also registered the Danish Chamber of Commerce, the Dutch Chamber of Commerce, the British Chamber of Commerce, the French Chamber of Commerce, the Spanish Chamber of Commerce and the Italian Chamber of Commerce to be responsible for selling rye to various parts of Europe, especially the United Kingdom, Spain and Italy where the price of rye is higher. Especially Spain, although the land area is quite large, but there are many mountains. It is okay to engage in animal husbandry, but the conditions for agriculture are far worse than those in France, even worse than those in Germany. It is certain that this time Marin threw out hundreds of millions of pounds of rye, which will definitely cause turbulence in European grain prices. And a large amount of money will inevitably flow to the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. Of course, Marin is not limited to collecting coins, and other valuable goods can also be used as payment. For example, excellent horses, cattle and sheep. In addition, metals and metal products such as gold, silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin can also be used to pay for grain. In short, Marin did not want the grain to be moldy in the granary, and he had to replace it with a large number of usable and easy-to-preserve materials. Suddenly, a subordinate reported that Amerigo and the fleet to India were back. Marin was stunned at first, and then ecstatic. Last spring, Marin asked his fleet, led by the navigator Amerigo, to go south to Spain and set off for India with the Spanish fleet. The reason for this is that Marin's army began to lack gunpowder. In particular, there was a lack of saltpeter. This also led to the shortage of gunpowder after Marin sent out the whole country's troops to fight against the Bassa coalition. If the German princes united to fight against Marin, Marin would not have enough gunpowder to fight against them. Otherwise, Marin would not surrender to those princes. Marin's Spanish phalanx and artillery ships consumed a lot of gunpowder. Especially for artillery ships, the amount of gunpowder consumed in a round of volleys was amazing. The naval battle in the western waters of the Jutland Peninsula consumed almost half of the gunpowder. Although it was very cool and the Danish fleet was defeated, Marin did not dare to use gunboats easily. Then, the fleet was sent to India to continue buying saltpeter. Only with enough saltpeter can enough gunpowder be prepared and enough firing rights can be obtained. Otherwise, all the muskets under Marin's command would become fire sticks, and the artillery would become scrap iron lumps. The British can dominate the sea, and the East India Company gets hundreds of tons of saltpeter from India every year. However, the problem is that Spain and Portugal will share India in the future. If the two countries join forces to cut off Marin's saltpeter supply, Marin's military combat effectiveness will immediately drop several levels. Therefore, the development of Chilean saltpeter is inevitable. Moreover, Chile has large reserves of saltpeter and rich surface minerals. Except for the severe water shortage and relatively hot desert areas, other costs are relatively low. However, Marin will not stop purchasing saltpeter from India in the future. Why? Because if Marin doesn't buy it, Spain and Portugal will buy it. If they buy it, they will increase the firepower at sea and affect Marin's maritime hegemony. Therefore, Marin's plan is to continue to buy a large amount of saltpeter from India even if Chilean saltpeter is developed in the future. If nothing else, it is to prevent other European countries from buying enough saltpeter from India. When the naval battle breaks out, Marin has sufficient saltpeter and the opponent has insufficient saltpeter. Once the guns are fired, the difference will be very obvious. The naval guns on our side can fire as much as they want, while the opponent's artillery ammunition is limited. It is clear who will win and who will lose. Moreover, even if there is too much saltpeter, Marin is not worried. Because saltpeter can be used as a special nitrogen fertilizer, which is much stronger than manure. Marin remembered that after the large-scale development of Chilean saltpeter in the 19th century, the Liverpool Trade Group in the UK controlled the saltpeter trade in Chile. In addition to a part of it being used to make gunpowder, the rest was exported to Europe and the United States as a special fertilizer. Among them, American agriculture was once very dependent on Chilean saltpeter. It was not until the early 20th century that the Germans developed synthetic ammonia, and the world's demand for Chilean saltpeter was greatly reduced. Then, the Chilean saltpeter trade declined. For now, Marin can only consider buying a large amount of saltpeter from India. As for the saltpeter in the Chilean desert, it is not known where it is. Even if it is found, the preparation work in advance to mine it in a harsh environment is also very complicated. Therefore, within 2 or 3 years, Marin still can't think of mining a large amount of saltpeter from Chile, and still has to rely on Indian saltpeter first. Of course, if the route to Daming was opened, saltpeter could also be imported from Daming at a lower price. You know, Daming saltpeter is very cheap. After fine processing and purification, it is only 30 or 40 coins per pound, which is cheaper than Indian saltpeter. The price of Indian saltpeter is about 54 coins per pound, and it has not been refined, so the purity is lower than Daming saltpeter. In fact, the saltpeter purification technology at this time in the Ming dynasty was also very simple, that is, dissolving the saltpeter and boiling it with radish slices, using the adsorption of radish slices to absorb magnesium sulfate and other impurities in the saltpeter, making the saltpeter purer. Because the normal MgSO4, 7H2O hydrate of magnesium sulfate is very easy to deliquesce. And saltpeter is very afraid of water, so the presence of MgSO4, 7H2O can easily make saltpeter ineffective. If it is not removed, saltpeter cannot be stored for a long time. Therefore, the saltpeter imported by Marin from India has actually been processed. That is to say, use the European radish, turnip, slice it and cook it with the saltpeter solution, then evaporate the water to obtain the saltpeter with MgSO4, 7H2O removed. This purified saltpeter can be stored for a long time in a sealed oil paper bag. Unlike untreated saltpeter, even if it is sealed and stored, it will deliquesce and become ineffective in a few years. In fact, when his subordinates reported to Marin that Amerigo's ship had returned, Amerigo's fleet had not returned to Emden and was still in the Atlantic. This is because Amerigo's fleet acted with the Spanish fleet and stayed in the port of Cadiz, Spain for a long time. But when the intelligence personnel sent by Marin to Spain stopped at the port of Cadiz, they sent people to report to Marin by land as soon as possible when Amerigo's fleet stayed in the port of Cadiz. Of course, in a few days, Amerigo's fleet will appear in the port of Emden. By then, Marin will have enough saltpeter to fight another large-scale war. In order to purify the Indian saltpeter, Marin has issued an order to send people to various places to purchase a large number of European radishes, turnips, to further purify the saltpeter and facilitate the long-term storage of the saltpeter. Marin himself went to Emden port in person, where he waited for the return of Amerigo's fleet. Chapter 578, India doesn't have much saltpeter. A few days later, at the dock of Emden, Marin had been looking at the sea with a monocular telescope. According to intelligence, Amerigo's fleet should arrive today. After waiting for several hours, the top of a sail appeared in Marin's telescope. Then, the entire sail, from top to bottom, slowly emerged in Marin's sight. Then, it was the second, the third, until all 10 ships appeared in Marin's telescope. Back, Grand Duke, they are back. Everyone around him got excited and began to cheer. Marin was also very excited, but pretended to be reserved. After all, he is now a Grand Duke, and he always has to pay attention to the impact. In fact, Marin did not attach much importance to the significance of this voyage. Even Amerigo completed this voyage, and he had no credit. Because this is a route that Columbus has discovered, and it has nothing to do with Amerigo. Moreover, the status of the two is now different. Columbus is a baron, and he has 2 baron titles. And Amerigo is only a hereditary knight, a big difference. Of course, Marin had promised before that he would let Amerigo lead the team to find the route to the Ming dynasty next time. As long as he completes this achievement, Amerigo will also be eligible for promotion to baron. And this trip to India is actually because of Amerigo's yearning for India, and has nothing to do with making achievements. After all, in the eyes of Europeans, India is a mysterious and rich place. As an adventurous navigator, it is absolutely unrealistic for Amerigo to say that he does not yearn for India. However, this is the 3rd time that Marin's fleet has gone to India. Therefore, Marin has no feelings about running the Indian route. The reason why Marin came to Emden port to greet Amerigo was actually for the saltpeter that Amerigo bought from India. Before, Marin asked Amerigo to buy 600 tons of saltpeter from India. With these 600 tons of saltpeter, Marin can shake up immediately. Even if he singles out all the German princes, he has the confidence to be undefeated. Moreover, another very important use is to use it on the battlefield in England. Specifically, Marin plans to send a fleet to fight the English fleet. At least, drive the English fleet away from the Irish Sea. In this way, Marin can take Edward's army, including Edward himself, through the Irish Sea to the English mainland and directly participate in the war for the throne. In terms of the number of warships, Marin is definitely not as good as England. After all, the 5 Ports Alliance has a lot of ships. Therefore, Marin can only rely on the powerful firepower of the warships to defeat the English fleet and take Edward and his troops to the English mainland. Therefore, Marin needs the fleet to have sufficient firepower. Otherwise, if there is no ammunition halfway through the fight, it will be over. In terms of the number of sailors, Marin is far inferior to England. Before, Marin asked Edward to go to Rome to appeal, both for the reason of finding legal basis and for waiting for saltpeter from Amerigo's fleet. Only when Amerigo came back with hundreds of tons of saltpeter, Marin had the confidence to send out the fleet to defeat the English fleet and transport Edward's army across the sea to the British Isles. In general, what Marin was waiting for was not Amerigo, but the hundreds of tons of saltpeter. Of course, as a sophisticated politician, Marin would definitely not say so. On the surface, he would warmly welcome Amerigo's return, with an "I am very optimistic about you" look. Not long after, Amerigo's ship docked. Amerigo was the first to jump off the deck and stood on the long bridge pier. After walking on land, Amerigo did not immediately come to Marin, but shouted, "Ah, land! Stable land! I haven't felt down to earth for a long time." Indeed, after a year and half a year of bumpy ride on the sea, the crew missed the feeling of being down to earth. Although they landed in the port of Cadiz, it was just passing by. Now, back in the port of Emden, Amerigo and his sailors will have a long vacation to experience the comfortable life on land. After sighing, Amerigo ran to the platform where Marin was, bent down and greeted Marin. "Ah, respected Duke, your most trusted Captain Amerigo extends his sincere greetings to you." But someone next to him reminded. "Lord Vespucci, Lord Marin is now a Grand Duke." "Ah." Amerigo was stunned. When he left, Marin had just taken over the Duchy of Schleswig not long ago. Earlier, Marin was just a count. Why is your status so high? If I go to sea again, won't you become a king when I come back? Amerigo said stupidly. Everyone around laughed kindly, and everyone followed Marin. Many old people have watched Marin go from baron to earl, then from earl to duke, and now to the Grand Duke. And everyone's status has also risen with the tide. Even if the title is not promoted, the benefits are indispensable. Therefore, when Marin is prosperous, they also benefit. In fact, the statistics of this war merit have been basically completed. In a few days, the enthronement ceremony will be held. The Grand Duchy is already very close to an independent sovereign kingdom. A large number of new nobles will appear in this award ceremony. And this time, many people who have won military merits accompanied Marin. Seeing the bright prospects of either upgrading the title or financial rewards, everyone is actually happy. After all the sailors disembarked, Marin began to arrange for port personnel to take over the ship. Many unloading dock workers also took their positions and prepared to unload the cargo from the ship. According to the rules, Marin gave a very official speech to all sailors. However, the effect does not seem to be very good. Except for a small number of captains and first mates who want to be motivated and pretend to listen carefully to the leader's speech, other sailors are generally absent-minded. For these sailors, the most important thing now is to go home and reunite with their families, and then go out to wave. Marin probably knew that his speech was not very popular. After speaking for a few minutes, he announced that the sailors were allowed to go to Las Vegas after returning home. In addition to buying gambling chips by yourself, the money spent on finding girls in Las Vegas will be reimbursed. Of course, each person is limited to finding only one girl at a time. After hearing the benefits given by Marin, the originally absent-minded sailors suddenly became excited, making strange noises and shouting "Long live." For these sailors who have been tossed on the sea for a year and more than half a year, going to Las Vegas to drink for free and find girls is really to their liking. Even Amerigo has the idea of going to Las Vegas to relax. However, after the sailors and captains were dismissed, Amerigo could not leave. He had to report the trade results to Marin together with Draka, who was in charge of trade matters. What? Only 450 tons of saltpeter? Didn't I ask to buy 600 tons? Marin said dissatisfiedly after listening to the report. Draka, who was in charge of trade, also felt aggrieved. He argued. Sir, it's not that we don't want to buy the full 600 tons, but we don't have the stock. In fact, I heard from those Indian merchants that the annual supply of saltpeter there is actually only hundreds of tons. The 2 times Sir Columbus and I went to India, we had already purchased 330 tons of saltpeter. This time, we bought another 450 tons. Now, all the saltpeter available in Calicut and several surrounding Indian trading ports has been bought by us. Even the Spaniards wanted to buy saltpeter, but couldn't buy it. You mean, the annual production of saltpeter in India is only hundreds of tons? Marin asked with a frown. Draka nodded quickly. Calicut was the largest foreign trade port in India at this time, and most of the saltpeter used for foreign trade was concentrated here. It was not available in Calicut, and it was difficult to buy it in other places. Even if it could be bought, it was only in small quantities. Marin thought for a long time before he was relieved. Why? He suddenly remembered that firearms were not popular enough in India at this time. India is now in a period where the Delhi Sultanate and many small countries are on par. The famous Mughal Empire was not established until 1526. Now, no country in India has a well-organized musketeer unit. Even in Europe, where the degree of gunpowder is higher, few countries have well-organized musketeers. In India now, only bronze cannons need gunpowder. Therefore, in the case of a small market, Indians are not very enthusiastic about producing saltpeter. It was not until the establishment of the Mughal Empire, which had a large number of musketeers, that Indians paid more attention to the production of saltpeter. After the 17th century, the British were able to buy hundreds of tons of saltpeter from India every year. Now, because the market is not big, Indians don't pay much attention to the production and sale of saltpeter. Naturally, there is not much saltpeter that Marin can buy. In fact, Marin bought all the saltpeter in stock of the big merchants in Calicut, India, through 3 purchases. If you want more, you have to go again next year, but you can only buy hundreds of tons. After all, the current production of Indian saltpeter is like that. Marin patted his head and felt a little headache. It seems that I have to go to Daming to buy it, and develop Chilean saltpeter. During this period, the Ming Empire must have no shortage of saltpeter. Of course, it is not because the scale of the Ming dynasty's firearms troops is so large, in fact, it is indeed large, compared with other countries, but because the Ming dynasty people need a lot of saltpeter to make firecrackers. The reason is so overbearing. The people of Daming need to set off firecrackers, so there is a great demand for saltpeter. At the same time, the supply of saltpeter is also sufficient. In ancient times, there were saltpeter mines in Sichuan, Hanzhong, northwest China, Yunnan and Guizhou. And in the eastern region, boiling earth saltpeter is also popular. Therefore, the supply of saltpeter is sufficient. Moreover, the price is cheaper than India. The amount of saltpeter purchased from Ming dynasty must be larger than that from India. As for the huge saltpeter mine in the northern desert of Chile, it goes without saying. The only trouble is that the environment there is extremely harsh, and there is an extreme lack of water. It seems that it is also difficult to open up the mining. Therefore, Marin now wants the navy to open fire, but it seems that the conditions are not yet mature. However, these 450 tons of saltpeter are enough for Marin to fight 2 major battles. Chapter 579, Indian Untouchables. Amerigo went to India this time with a total of 10 ships, all with a displacement of more than 200 tons. The average cargo capacity of each ship can reach more than 120 tons, and the total cargo capacity can reach 1,200 tons. However, due to the shortage of saltpeter, the fleet only brought back 450 tons of saltpeter. In addition, there were 100 tons of copper and 30 tons of tin that were planned earlier. Of course, there was also a quota of 50,000 pounds of spices. However, these goods added up to a total of only 602.6 tons. In total, half of the fleet had to be empty. Of course, Marin also mentioned that Amerigo and Draka recruited craftsmen and women who were proficient in cotton spinning in India. Therefore, Draka also specially recruited such talents when purchasing other goods. However, under the influence of Hinduism, Indian society is clearly divided into classes. Those superiors of high castes with white skin have a decent life and are protected by law. It is basically impossible for them to accept Draka's recruitment and go overseas. Therefore, the craftsmen who can make cotton spinning wheels and women who are good at cotton spinning recruited by Draka are all dark-skinned Indian untouchables. In India, even in the 21st century, the status of untouchables is still low, and they are not worthy of sitting with people of higher castes, otherwise they will be beaten. In ancient times, this situation was even more serious. In India in the early 16th century, untouchables were not regarded as human beings in India, but just human-shaped animals. The residences of untouchables were also strictly separated from those of higher castes. Moreover, the laws of India in this era did not protect untouchables. If a person of higher caste killed an untouchable, the maximum compensation would be the money or food of a livestock. If the wife and daughter of an untouchable family are beautiful, they can easily be violated by men of higher castes. Moreover, the untouchables did not dare to beat the higher caste who violated their wives because their wives were violated. Even if they went to the officials, no one would accept it. Therefore, in ancient India, although untouchables were not slaves, their status was similar to that of slaves. For example, this time, Draka recruited craftsmen who knew how to make cotton spinning wheels and women who knew how to weave cotton cloth at a high price, and was favored by a local high caste broker. Because Draka offered a price of 5 gold coins per craftsman and 1 gold coin per woman who knew how to weave cotton cloth. In India, even after the promotion of Marin and the Spaniards, the price of pepper only increased from 1.5 pfennigs to 2 pfennigs. 1 gold coin, equivalent to 60 pfennigs, can buy 30 pounds of pepper. This local high caste broker in India named Sika was very envious of the price offered by Draka. However, at this price, it was obviously impossible to recruit high caste craftsmen and women in the local area. Therefore, the vicious Sika simply gathered a local gangster gang, directly looted several untouchable villages, and captured 50 untouchable craftsmen and 300 untouchable women who were proficient in cotton spinning. In line with the principle that a thief should not leave empty-handed, Sika not only kidnapped these untouchable craftsmen and untouchable women who were proficient in cotton spinning, but also kidnapped the wives of those craftsmen and the husbands of the untouchable women, and wanted to sell them to Draka. As for the consequences of kidnapping so many untouchables, Sika only bribed the local judge with 20 gold coins, and the matter was over. When these people were sold to Draka, the 50 craftsmen and 300 women who were proficient in cotton spinning alone were worth up to 550 gold coins. Moreover, when Draka learned that Sika had brought the spouses of these recruited, untouchable craftsmen and untouchable women, Draka did not deny it. Of course, he would not give a high price. After all, that was not what he wanted. And for the wives of the 50 craftsmen and the middle-aged husbands of the 300 untouchable women, Draka gave a total of 70 gold coins, equivalent to 12 pfennigs each. In this way, Draka only spent 620 gold coins and obtained 350 pairs of middle-aged couples. On average, each person received less than 1 gold coin. At the same time, Marin needed 40 gold coins to buy black slaves from Portugal. For 700 people, it would cost 28,000 gold coins. This price shocked Marin when he reported it. What? You mean you only spent 620 gold coins to get 350 pairs of Indian couples? Doesn't that mean each person cost less than 1 gold coin? Marin was extremely surprised. Yes, Grand Duke, but this is not representative. Because these are people plundered by the gangster leader named Sika. Selling them to us is almost like selling stolen goods, so it's very cheap. Moreover, the judge in the small town where Sika is located is very corrupt. Sika bribed the judge with 20 gold coins. If it were a place with a better legal system, the cost might be more than this. Draka analyzed calmly. Marin smiled and said, "How big can it be? No matter how good the legal system is, it is still India. Untouchables are not considered human beings. As long as I offer 5 gold coins for a middle-aged man and woman, I guess the local nobles can't help but catch untouchables and sell them to me." As the soul of the Chinese people in the future, how could Marin not know the difficulties of the untouchables in India? In India, untouchables basically have no protection, and they still have a hard life even in the 21st century. It is precisely because they are looked down upon in India and their lives are not guaranteed. Therefore, in the colonial era, many untouchables were recruited by the British to South Africa, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius and other countries. Even after independence, the main ethnic groups in Mauritius, Guyana and other countries were Indians. Moreover, some of the untouchables were recruited abroad by force, while some were voluntary. Because they could not see any hope and future in India. So, it is better to go abroad for a try. Hearing that Marin was willing to offer 5 gold coins each, Draka smiled, and then said confidently, "Grand Duke, if you are really willing to offer 5 gold coins to ordinary Indian untouchables, I can guarantee that I will take away tens of thousands of Indian untouchables who are good at farming from India every year to help you develop colonies." That's a good idea. Marin's eyes lit up immediately. Before, he had considered the issue of using a large number of Japanese farmers in the colonies. However, Marin was very worried about the Japanese nation. The people of this nation are very humble and obedient when they are weak. But you must not be fooled by them, because when they become strong, they dare to tear a piece of meat off you. Although he sympathized with the Indian untouchables, Marin did not intend to let them go. After all, the Indian untouchables were cowardly and easier to control. Moreover, their agricultural skills were good, at least 100 times better than those of the black uncles. Although everyone had the same dark skin, one was honest and obedient and willing to work. The other was very restless, with only strength but unwilling to work. So, Marin decided that after using black slaves to open up the land passage in Panama, he would no longer introduce African slaves, but would introduce Japanese farmers, Javanese and Indian untouchables at the same time. Moreover, try to maintain a balance among the three. In this way, the serfs could not be of one mind, and it would be easier to rule. The most important thing is that the Indian untouchables were not only honest and obedient, and could do farm work, but also very cheap. If they were introduced in large quantities, price and cost factors would be very important conditions. The low prices in India led to a relatively low cost for getting a few untouchable serfs. And when buying black slaves from the Portuguese, those black slaves could not do any farm work, but they wanted 40 gold coins each, which was simply too expensive. If 100,000 black slaves were introduced, wouldn't it cost 4 million gold coins? Therefore, the Indian untouchables who were honest and obedient, knew how to do farm work, and were very cheap were Marin's better choice. Chapter 580, Tropical Fruit Plantation. Because half of the 10 ships were empty, Amerigo's fleet had enough space to transport the 700 Indian untouchables. At the same time, when Draka went to recruit untouchables, Amerigo also took people to the market to buy a batch of wooden cotton spinning wheels and human looms that were produced in abundance in India. That's not all, Amerigo also bought a large number of Indian cotton seeds and local sugarcane seeds. Anyway, there is space in the fleet, so bring it back by the way. In fact, Marin looked down on the cotton varieties in India. The variety of Indian cotton is called Asian cotton, also called coarse lint cotton. This kind of cotton has low yield and short fibers, which is not suitable for machine spinning and is only suitable for manual spinning and weaving. Therefore, it was gradually eliminated later. However, at this stage, both India and Ming dynasty use Asian cotton originating from India. The better quality upland cotton and sea island cotton are all native to Mexico in Central America and the islands in the Caribbean. Among them, the quality of sea island long staple cotton is the best. However, the growing conditions of sea island cotton are harsh and not suitable for global promotion. Therefore, in later generations, including China, the most popular is the upland cotton originating from Mexico, which is the kind of cotton seeds brought back by Columbus. Therefore, although Amerigo's starting point is good, India's Asian cotton varieties will eventually be eliminated. After all, Marin has the seeds of upland cotton. However, Marin is still very satisfied with Indian sugarcane. Why? No matter how bad India is, in this era, agriculture is definitely far superior to that of Europe. Therefore, the prices in India are very low, and even the price of human trafficking is relatively low. Agriculture is stronger than that in Europe, and the varieties are naturally good. According to Amerigo's inquiries in India, their sugarcane production is much higher than that of the Portuguese. At least, Indians know how to use manure. The sugarcane varieties cultivated for a long time using fertilizers are naturally better than those grown by the Portuguese. If the Indian sugarcane seedlings were a small surprise, then the other species that Amerigo presented to Marin were completely big surprises. First, the seeds of bananas and coconuts. Bananas did not have seeds in later generations. They were grown by cutting off split buds or using underground stems to cultivate banana seedlings. But in fact, bananas originally had seeds. The tiny black spots distributed in the banana flesh are actually the seeds of bananas. It's just that they have degenerated after long-term cultivation. The banana seeds that Amerigo brought back this time, although very small, still exist. As long as Marin sends people to cultivate them carefully, he can still grow bananas. Needless to say, coconuts have seeds. Amerigo drank the coconut milk of a coconut in India and ate the coconut meat. He thought it was good, so he collected the seeds of bananas, which were also delicious, and brought them back together with the seeds of coconuts. As a navigator who helped Marin explore Granada, Amerigo keenly felt that these two fruits seemed to be able to be grown in Granada. So he brought the seeds back. Sure enough, after getting the seeds of bananas and coconuts, Marin was very pleased and rewarded Amerigo with 1,000 gold coins. Looking at the seeds of bananas and coconuts, Marin was overjoyed. At present, Granada has been developed on a large scale, and Cuba and Panama are also being developed vigorously. Although there are already crops such as rice and sugarcane suitable for planting in tropical areas, Marin always feels uncomfortable. Why? As a tropical island, how can there be no tropical fruits? For Marin, the tropical fruits he is most familiar with are probably bananas, pineapples and coconuts. If you live in the tropics in the future, you will probably be despised if you have not eaten these three fruits. Unless you live in the tropical area of the Sahara Desert. Anyway, in Marin's impression, the tropics are banana trees, pineapple trees and coconut trees everywhere. Of course, there are also rubber trees and so on. Although it is difficult for Marin to get fresh fruits when planting these tropical fruits in tropical colonies. After all, the refrigeration technology of this era is very poor, or almost non-existent. However, Marin can eat canned fruit. The canned fruit technology is so simple. Just get a glass bottle, soak pineapple slices in dilute salt water, boil it in a steamer, and then seal it with a cork and wax it. It can be preserved for 10 months. If it is sent to the mainland, Marin can eat it. As For bananas, Marin does not have to eat canned bananas. Because bananas are dried bananas, which are also very good snacks. And coconuts can also be dried into coconuts and shipped back as food. You know, in some Pacific Island countries in later generations, coconuts are important agricultural products and food. And coconut juice can also be shipped back to Europe by canning. However, among the three common tropical fruits of bananas, pineapples and coconuts, pineapples are not available in Marin. Because pineapples are still grown in Brazil. Now that the Portuguese have not occupied Brazil, naturally no one has discovered this pineapple. Therefore, Marin now only has the ability to grow bananas and coconuts. However, Marin thinks that there should be seedless bananas now. After all, bananas have been cultivated for more than 1,000 years, and there should be seedless varieties. So, Amerigo found an Indian untouchable craftsman who came to Emden with the ship, and asked about seedless bananas through an interpreter. Through the inquiry, Marin confirmed that there were indeed seedless banana varieties in India. It was just that Amerigo didn't know much about it, so he bought the seeds of bananas with seeds. After all, Amerigo had never eaten bananas, and didn't know that there were seedless varieties. Moreover, seedlings of seedless bananas were also difficult to carry. Therefore, Amerigo missed the seedless banana variety. Of course, Marin didn't care so much. Even if there were only coconut seeds, it was not bad. Because Marin liked to drink coconut juice in his later life. As long as coconut planting is promoted in Cuba or Grenada and coconut plantations are developed, it will be easy for Marin to drink coconut juice in the future. The method is very simple, similar to canning. Put the coconut juice in a glass bottle, boil it in a steamer, then plug it with a cork and wax it, and a bottle of coconut juice is ready. As long as this canned coconut juice is shipped back to Europe by ship, Marin can drink the long-lost coconut juice. As for bananas, Marin thought about it and decided to send people to send those seeds to the colony. It just so happened that Marin was going to send that batch of Indian untouchables to Cuba. These coconut seeds and banana seeds were just right to be taken there together. These Indian untouchables obviously knew how to grow coconuts and bananas. It was just right to let them take care of these fruit trees. When pineapple seeds were obtained in the future and seedless banana seedlings were obtained from India, Marin planned to promote these three tropical fruits on a large scale in Cuba, Grenada, Panama and other places, and make them an important food in tropical regions. Anyway, Marin will send people to India to buy supplies in the future. At that time, he will order seedless banana seedlings to be obtained. As for pineapples, people may need to be sent to Brazil to find them. In fact, among these three tropical fruits, the most suitable one for canning is probably pineapple. Canned pineapples are sour and sweet and very popular. When Marin was a child in his previous life, he especially liked to eat canned pineapples. Every time I eat canned pineapple, I not only eat up the pineapple slices, but also drink up the water that soaked the pineapple slices. That sour and sweet taste is most attractive to children and girls. Of course, these tropical fruit plantations are only auxiliary, and the area will not be too large. After all, the cultivation of rice and sugarcane is the main force. And those tropical fruits are actually just some auxiliary food. At the same time, provide some canned fruits and dried bananas and coconuts to the European market. But no matter what, these novel things will definitely open up the European market. After all, the unsophisticated European guys must have never eaten these things at this time.